Hello, today we're going to be going over a method to better design your homebrew classes that better mirrors a professional design process. What does that mean? Well, it means that we have to define everything through the player experience, which means we have to define that first. Although not quite first, because first we just need inspiration, and your idea can come from anywhere. And hey, if this is a thing that you've heard before, the important thing is execution, not the idea. Then this is what they mean, because the idea is where we start. It's the inspiration. It's the first thing that we think of, what we want to do, and then the execution is everything that follows. Wild magic is weird. It feels more like gambling than it does like trying to contain an immense power. And this, by the way, is not an effective analysis of wild magic as a system. This is just a basic starting point for the class that I want to design. So this is not wild magic is objectively bad and I'm gonna fix it. This is, my starting point is, I don't like the way wild magic works. Here's what I would rather see. I want to create a sense of enormous power that the player is struggling to control. That is my goal for this class design. And that is the beginnings of our player experience, which is a lot better than I don't like wild magic, I want to make it better. Notice the core tension prevalent in this. It does two things. One, it implies the way the mechanics are going to play out eventually. How does it do that? Well, pretty easy. By implying a core decision point and a core tension, we can start figuring out how we can make mechanics that represent one and the other that are both equivalent in terms of achieving a particular goal, and different risks and rewards associated with either of them means that the player doesn't always have all of the information they need in order to make the perfect choice. That means tension. But it also does a second thing. It creates what you could call an internal conflict or a central conflict, which are really core components of storytelling. So you can see how the mechanics and the design and the systems, as well as the narrative and the theme and the storytelling, all come from one point and are baked into the DNA of the class from the very beginning. In this way, we can build both of those components of the class in parallel from the same foundation. That way, we'll never stray and we don't have to come up with these weird ways to layer one on top of another later. So what's the tension point? The tension point is, if only I could control this power, something. And the something, the completion of that statement, is going to be what guides us moving forward. This is how the tension will manifest and how it will be expressed in gameplay. So we have a core tension and we have an idea of what it's supposed to create eventually in terms of an emotional target. Well, now we must give players decisions that express the tension and not mechanics that express the theme. But of course, we want mechanics to express the theme. We were just talking about putting gameplay and narrative side by side, so what's the deal? Well, the difference is we're not at a stage where we can start applying mechanics yet. We don't quite have enough information in order to be able to assess whether mechanics are going to accomplish our player experience yet. In order to do that, we need to define the tension a little bit further. If you start building mechanics now, you're answering a different question, and it's a question you don't want to be answering. You'll end up with results like, well, if magic is hard to control, then it should be unpredictable, right? You have the theme of uncontrollable magic, and then the mechanic, unpredictability, random tables, roll to find out what happens. And that kind of works, but we can do so much better. How can we do better? We create decisions that express the tension. In order to do that, we have to go back to the tension. If only I could control this power. Because now we have a goal. The goal is to control the power. And part of what we need to do later is figure out how to make that the player's goal, which will be part of what we do with the system, but don't worry about that yet. First, we have to express the tension. And our tension implies a decision. If only I could control this power. Well, how? How could you possibly control this power? Now, this could be an excellent narrative baseline, but it's also an excellent design baseline, because now we're starting to figure out what decisions the player could possibly make that might express the tension. We're not talking about individual things that the player is doing that need to be expressed via mechanics. We're talking about decisions, and the decisions themselves are what create the player experience. It's not about which decision the player makes, it's about the player making the decision in the first place. Now we can start designing the system. Not the mechanics, not just yet. Why not the mechanics yet? What's the difference between a system and a mechanics? Well, a system is really figuring out how all your little different parts are gonna interact in a general sense. The mechanics are all the little parts that make that cycle take place. So the system that we're going to build is going to be something like wild magic, but different. There is one part from the wild magic system that I like that we're going to steal, but we're going to steal very carefully and very precisely in a way that we know exactly how we're going to use that element later. Rather than simply taking swaths of the system or the mechanics, we're going to look at the way the system works, and we're going to steal a part of that. And the part that we're going to steal is the randomness and the uncertainty that that creates, because it does do a wonderful job of making you feel out of control. But if we were to leave it at that, if we were to leave it there and just leave it at the way the magic system works in wild magic, where you just roll and you get a result, what we have is the sense that something is happening to you. We don't have the sense that something is within you and just struggling to get out that you constantly have to contain. You have the sense of, I'm going to cast a spell and then a thing happens to me. Enter the volatility die. My solution for this, where we can create some sense of uncertainty, but still make it feel like it's something that the player is doing rather than something that's happening externally of them, is we're going to allow them to change some of the outcomes. We're going to allow them some semblance of control over what might happen should the worst occur, should the magic go wild, or in this case, go volatile. So how does the volatility die work? Well, again, we want to start high level and then work our way down to the specifics. So we're not going to start with mechanics. We're just going to start with an overview for how I think the system should play out. First, you want to assign spells to the different faces of the die. That way, what can happen is a player can make a roll, and then they can roll the volatility die to see what spell they actually cast. Now, yes, this is going to have a lot of complications that we're going to have to deal with when we actually start writing the rule. But for now, it's sufficient to understand that this is the basic relationship between these two things. By allowing the player to change some of the possibilities of volatile magic, it creates a much stronger sense of anticipation, because now they have something very specific that they can start rooting for, that they hope will happen and that they hope won't happen. Wild magic, because it's so unpredictable and because there are so many possible outcomes, you end up in a situation where the player is simply anticipating, I hope I get a good result, versus I hope I get a bad result. By contrast, a very specific thing that you're anticipating, such as, when I try to cast Fireball on the enemies, I sure hope I don't accidentally give them all mage armor, is a much more interesting thing to anticipate, because you're anticipating specific outcomes, and you have ties to those outcomes. They're personal to you, because you've decided which potential outcomes can occur. This also helps create iteration in player decisions, because if something goes wrong, they can always go back and say, that was a little bit too disastrous. I'm not willing to risk that. And they can make decisions about how much risk they're willing to tolerate with regard to how they put together the volatility die. Keeping the number of possible outcomes limited, and by giving the player direct control over that, the player can now strategize around those potential outcomes. They very often won't even work out very well for the player, but because the player has a very specific set of player decisions, they've made the conscious choice to create the risks that they created for themselves. The system becomes very distinct from the way wild magic works, because it's no longer just, I hope a good thing happens versus I hope a bad thing doesn't happen. It's, I hope this specific good thing happens. That means that the player gets to, in some sense, define their own risk, but not in every sense, and that's also important. The player defines their risks only in an immediate sense, but the designer, or the DM, defines the set of all possible risks from which the player chooses. The way the volatile die is set up, you, the DM, can easily play with what the potential risks are by just changing around the spell list. And that's really useful to you, because no class is ever going to be 100% applicable to your game. But by the class designer building in a bunch of little tools that the DM can tweak and mess with very quickly and very easily, you, as the designer, can make sure that the core experience of the class is still being fulfilled, while the DM gets to tweak all the little systems that he wants to make sure that the class is working for that specific situation and that specific game and that specific player. All right, now that we've got a lot of these nice, broad ideas down of how we're going to sort of get everything to work together, let's start refining the system a little bit. As you can probably tell, this is not anywhere close to being done. So, let's start trying to anticipate some of the questions. I'm going to throw out some of the problems that I think it might cause, and then I'm going to give an idea of how I think it can be fixed. And then we'll start writing a rule that tries to sort of accommodate those. The first question is, when do you even roll the volatile die? We know that the volatile exists, basically how it works, but we don't know when you actually bust it out and use it, or how often it should be. So I'm thinking it should be often enough that the player sees it as a real threat that their spells might go haywire. but definitely not often enough that the player shouldn't get to cast most of their spells. Generally speaking, the player should cast their spells. I'm going to say something like 80% of the time, the player should get their spell off no problem. Now, 80% is pretty arbitrary, but I like to put down that quantifiable point so that I can just say 80% is the target, and then we're going to try to get as close to that target as we can. We can always adjust that target later. If we start playing through things, start playtesting, start trying to refine some other stuff, and we come back and we go, you know what, 80% is way too high or way too low, we can absolutely adjust that. But putting in a concrete baseline starting point is a really good way to get yourself going. The second thing I want to worry about is targeting. What targets does it actually hit when it goes volatile? And I think you should just hit everything. If you cast Fireball and you accidentally cast Mage Armor, everyone in that distance gets fireballed. If you cast Fireball and you accidentally Volatile Die cast Mage Armor, everyone in that radius gets Mage Armor. If it's Hold Person, everyone in that radius has to make a saving throw. Now this can be crazy. You can get really crazy effects this way, but in some ways that's the point, but also because it happens only sometimes, very infrequently, the player can't anticipate that it's going to happen, and that means that they're not going to be able to really utilize that power in any strategic sense, in any tactical sense. And that brings up another interesting point is, how do you make it so that this always has benefits, but that hitting everyone thing isn't the only benefit? Because otherwise that means that sometimes your spell just causes huge problems for you, and that can de-incentivize spellcasting, which is going to be a huge problem for a class that is clearly going to be built around the spellcasting. So the way I think we can solve this is by just making it so that everything is always upcast. Kind of the way Warlock works, where when you cast a spell, it's just cast at the maximum level. The Volatile Die can work similarly. But because this is probably going to be a class that utilizes spell slots, the way it's working out so far, it seems like that's probably where it's headed. I think it makes sense so that every spell that goes off via the Volatility Die is cast at the highest level spell that you can, +1. And in order to make that work, I think it should be a half caster. And I can go into more why when we get into the specifics, but I'm thinking half caster for this. And the last problem I have is that if the player can add exclusively offensive or exclusively defensive spells to the die, then they can just also play to that strength. And if they add exclusively offensive spells, then they just never cast anything other than offensive spells. And if something goes off, they get nothing but benefit. So we want to make sure that there's always this tension between risk and reward in this case. So in order to do that, the best way is probably just to assign schools of magic to different values on the die. Because remember, it's 5th edition, and in 5th edition, you want to keep things pretty simple. And this is getting kind of complex, but we're going to try to keep it down as much as possible. Now, for the sake of completion, here's what it might look like as an early draft rule. A lot still has to change. In fact, everything is still up in the air because we don't know what's going to change and what isn't. We don't know what's going to work and what won't. We have some solid hypotheses, and remember, the most important thing is that the things that we've stated very clearly and have very clear goals with them, which means I'm sure with the first iteration, our goals won't be achieved. That doesn't mean the design is bad. It just means it needs iteration. If you don't know what your goals are, then your design process isn't very good. But we've created this with a really solid process, and we know what to look for going forward. Is it done? Not even close. But if you look, all of the things that we just talked about have been accounted for. We're tying the consistency of spellcasting in with wisdom so that you can raise it if you like, or dump wisdom if you don't want consistency. We've made it so that the target of the Volatile Die is the same as your initial spell. We've also added to the rule that the spell that you cast is the spell slot that you expend, but the Volatility Die acts as though you've cast it at the highest spell that you have spell slots for, +1. That way players aren't punished merely for casting spells. They're instead punished if they cast spells thoughtlessly, if they don't think about what the potential outcomes might be, and because they have control over what those potential outcomes might be, they have no reason to not think about that. We've also made it so that different values on the die correspond to different schools of magic, which again, that'll help really broaden the kinds of spells that end up on the die without allowing players to circumvent that core player experience. The really important thing to remember with this is that it's a baseline, and it's a really good baseline that we can start building from. It's by no means done. The system isn't done, not even close. We barely even added any mechanics. Balance, iteration, playtesting, all that stuff is going to come way later. First, we want to make sure that we have a really strong foundation set up so that we know what direction we want to go. That way, when we playtest and iterate, we can see when the class is going off of the direction that we want to go and figure out a way to get it back onto that track. In part 2, we're going to talk more about how to actually derive mechanics and class features from this baseline, how to expand the baseline if necessary, and how to expound on it in order to create subclasses. Okay, bye.